Dust swirled through canyon heat. Leather creaked like dying breath. Mesquite smoke curled thick as secrets. Here's why this matters. In the barren stretches of New Mexico Territory 1852, one ranch owner's cruelty became the feast that destroyed him from within. Jacob Garcia ran the Crimson Ridge estate like a kingdom built on broken backs. His table groaned with roasted meats while those who worked his land starved. But in the kitchen, where iron pots bubbled and knives gleamed, a woman named Sophia Brown kept a different kind of ledger. Not of cotton or cattle, but of bones. Of names crossed out. Of hunger weaponized. What the Garcia family ate that September wasn't wild game from the canyon. It wasn't beef from their own herd. And when they finally understood what had passed their lips, the screaming could be heard across 3 valleys. This is the story of appetite meeting justice, served cold on silver platters under a merciless western sun. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The kitchen at Crimson Ridge Estate breathed fire and shadow. September 14th, 1852, 6:47 p.m. The New Mexico sun had finally surrendered to dusk, but the heat remained, pressing against adobe walls like a living thing. Inside, Sophia Brown steadied a cast-iron pot over the open hearth, flames licking the blackened metal with hungry tongues. The air tasted of char and cumin, of something rendered down until it forgot what it had been. Sound, the hiss of fat meeting flame. The scrape of a blade against whetstone in the corner where Thomas Anderson, silent as stone, sharpened knives with mechanical precision. Outside, the distant bray of mules being corralled for the night. The low murmur of Spanish prayers drifting from the workers' quarters, half a mile distant across the canyon floor. Smell? Mesquite smoke thick enough to coat the lungs. The sharp tang of dried chilies hanging in braids from the rafters. Beneath it all, something metallic. Something that made the nostrils flare with recognition before the mind could name it. The smell of butchery, of meat that had hung too long in desert heat, of iron and earth and endings. Texture, adobe dust on every surface, gritty between the teeth. The rough hemp of flour sacks stacked against the western wall. The slick, warm surface of rendered fat as Sophia's fingers worked it into dough, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had measured mercy in teaspoons for 11 years. Above her head, boots thundered across wooden planks. The Garcia family gathering for their weekly feast. 14 people in pressed cotton and polished leather, a portrait of frontier prosperity. Jacob Garcia's voice boomed through the floorboards, telling some story about an Apache raid he'd allegedly survived, embellishing with each retelling. Laughter followed, sharp and careless as broken glass. Before we go deeper, pause here. Where are you right now? What time of day is it where you're watching this? Drop a comment below. Because what you're about to hear, it happened in broad daylight. It happened while people watched. If stories like this make you question everything you thought you knew about justice, tap that like button. Hit subscribe. The records we're opening were buried under lies for generations. Sophia moved through the kitchen in a pattern she could walk blind. Hearth to table, table to larder. Larder to the heavy wooden door that led to the smokehouse, where meat hung on iron hooks in the perpetual twilight. Her feet knew every warped board, every crack in the packed earth floor. She had mapped this space across 5 days of service, each one counted like a prisoner, marking time on stone walls. The New Mexico Territory in 1852 was a place where law bent like heat waves over canyon rock, where a man like Jacob Garcia could rule his 3,000 acres like a feudal lord, and no one in Santa Fe or Albuquerque would ask uncomfortable questions. The Compromise of 1850 had made this territory officially free, but freedom was a word that meant different things depending on which side of the kitchen door you stood. Behind Sophia, Thomas worked in his usual silence. He was perhaps 30, perhaps 50, the desert sun and brutality having aged him beyond counting. His hands moved with surgical precision, sectioning meat into portions that would feed the family above. He had learned butchery in Georgia before being sold west. He had learned silence even earlier. On the scarred pine workbench, 8 covered dishes waited. tamales wrapped in corn husks. A stew that bubbled in a clay pot, thick with what the Garcia family believed was venison. Roasted meat on a platter glazed with honey and crushed juniper berries. The presentation was beautiful, worthy of the finest hacienda in the territory. The butchery had been done 3 days prior, in the smokehouse where the walls kept more than temperature-controlled, where hooks had held hogs in winter, horses in spring, and other things when the ledgers stopped matching the head count. Jacob Garcia prided himself on his table. Travelers spoke of his hospitality. Priests blessed his meals. Politicians shook his hand in the territorial capital and commented on his generosity, his civic pride, his Christian charity. Everyone heard the stories. No one asked the questions. What would you do? Standing in a trading post in Albuquerque, while a rancher winked and boasted about his cook's special recipes, while you noticed that his workforce seemed to shrink every season, while bones turned up in the arroyos that didn't quite match the cattle count, would you speak, or would you buy another sack of flour and mind your business? Sophia had learned Crimson Ridge the way a hawk learns thermals, invisible but essential for survival. She knew which floorboard creaked loudest, which would betray her presence. She knew the weight of Jacob Garcia's hand when he was pleased with a meal, when he would press silver coins into her palm and call her a treasure. She knew the weight of that same hand when a roast was overcooked, when it would strike fast as a rattlesnake, leaving marks that lasted weeks. Hanging near the water barrel was a new addition, a wreath of dried sage and wildflowers, prepared for the christening happening this Sunday. Garcia's sister arriving from Missouri with her new husband, new hope, new life to celebrate. The wreath hung like a halo over a pit. Sophia never looked at the wreath. She looked at knives. The cleaver with the chipped edge. The long blade meant for carving. The small paring knife she kept tucked in the fold of her apron, a sliver of control in a world designed to strip it away. A pattern interrupt, caught like ash, in a ledger. Territorial Records Office, Santa Fe, September 11, 1852. Property inventory for Crimson Ridge Estate lists 52 contract laborers. Spring assessment recorded 47. Discrepancy noted but not investigated. One cattle ledger shows 17 head slaughtered for personal use. 23 separate meat sales recorded at market. Arithmetic does not reconcile. Upstairs, crystal chinked against pewter. Sophia could picture the dining hall without seeing it. The painting of Jacob Garcia's father, stern in his Confederate gray despite never having fought. The clock that ran 5 minutes slow, a constant source of complaint. The mantel where a collection of Apache arrowheads sat in a wooden box, each one supposedly pulled from Garcia's own flesh, though the scars never quite matched the stories. Thomas had once been ordered to clean that room. He had counted the arrowheads. There were 9. He had also counted the sets of boots in the mudroom, waiting to be polished. 12 pairs. But only 8 men lived in the main house. The other 4 pairs were smaller. Worn differently? Never claimed. The first course left the kitchen at 6:55 p.m. A pozole, shallow as a promise, carried up the narrow stairs by Amelia Moore. She was 16, taken from her mother in Texas 2 years prior when debts came due and Jacob Garcia happened to be buying. Her hands shook slightly as she balanced the tray. The door above thumped open, released a burst of laughter and lamplight, thumped closed again. Sophia ladled the second round into serving bowls, letting steam rise and blur her vision until the room softened into something bearable. Through the small window above the wash basin, she caught a glimpse of the yard. Cottonwood trees bending in the evening breeze. The smokehouse door, closed and latched with the iron hook she had filed a notch into 3 months ago. A dog, one of Garcia's hunting hounds, trotting past with its nose low, searching for scraps. She saw, too, the 3 men by the well. White shirts, sleeves rolled despite the cooling air, passing a jug between them. Garcia's foreman and 2 hired hands from Albuquerque, brought in for the harvest. They faced the kitchen window, saw the silhouettes moving behind the wavy glass, and turned deliberately away. They had learned the first rule of survival at Crimson Ridge: see nothing, say less. Sophia's world had narrowed over 11 years to the space between her hands. Chop, stir, season, serve. The reduction in the pot went glossy, catching the firelight like dark amber. In that glaze, counted across months of careful planning, lay something that looked like obedience but tasted like revolution. Jacob Garcia had a habit. At every meal he would boast about the quality of his table, the tenderness of the meat, the richness of the stew. He would lean back in his chair, thumbs hooked in his belt, and proclaim that Crimson Ridge offered the finest dining between Santa Fe and the California coast. His guests would agree, forks scraping plates clean, asking for recipes that Sophia would recite with downcast eyes and a voice smooth as rendered fat. That appetite had shadows. In winter, bones boiled for days in pots so large they required 2 people to lift. In spring, meat appeared on the table when no cattle had been slaughtered, when the henhouse remained full, when the smokehouse inventory didn't match the meals. In summer, the foreman would call roll at dawn and stumble over names, correcting himself with a cough, moving on before anyone could ask why Martinez wasn't answering, or where Chen had gone, or why the count kept dropping while the supper table stayed full. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It takes a territory to maintain a secret. It takes 5 merchants extending credit without asking hard questions. It takes one priest blessing a table he never inspects too closely. It takes a sheriff in Santa Fe who accepts generous donations and calls it civic partnership. What would you do, Father Mendoza, if the communion wafer stuck in your throat the same way those Sunday blessings did? Anecdote: quiet as a scorpion under stone. In the market at Albuquerque, a Pueblo woman selling pottery refused meat from a vendor who sourced from Crimson Ridge. She said nothing directly, only placed her hand over her heart and shook her head. The vendor laughed nervously. 2 other customers stepped back from his stall. No one wrote it down, but the vendor stopped buying from Garcia after that. Some knowledge spreads without words. At 7:08 p.m., the bell above the kitchen rang twice, the call for the second course. Sophia set out the serving platters with steady hands. The dishes waited like open mouths. The stew had darkened to the color of old blood. The roasted meat glistened with glaze, each piece carved to identical thickness, professional as any butcher's work. Thomas stood very still, his sharpening stone finally quiet. The pile of juniper berries he had been crushing sat finished in a small bowl. He wiped his palms on his trousers and tasted the air by habit, the way animals do before a storm. Somewhere beyond the canyon walls, thunder began its distant conversation with itself. The door swung open and the dining hall spilled its essence into the kitchen. Heat and lamplight and the careless music of people who believed the world was arranged for their pleasure, that meat appeared on platters by divine right, that the hands preparing their food had no memory, no mathematics, no capacity for anything beyond service. Sophia lifted the first platter. Her arms did not tremble. When she and Amelia crossed the threshold into the dining hall, the clock on the mantel marked each step, 1, 2, 3, as if counting a sentence finally coming due. Jacob Garcia raised his glass, firelight catching in the amber liquid. "To family," he declared, his voice filling the room like smoke, "and to the finest table in the New Mexico territory." His sister clapped her hands. A cousin reached for the meat, testing its tenderness with his fork. Someone laughed at a joke Sophia didn't hear. The world above the kitchen continued in its familiar rhythm, unaware that the rhythm had already changed, that the meat they were cutting, the stew they were spooning, the feast they were celebrating, carried a weight beyond hunger. Below, Sophia's feet found their pattern again. Hearth, table, larder, door, but the pattern had another point tonight. The smokehouse. The latch, with its distinctive notch, filed deliberately so she would know if it had been disturbed. It had been once on a Tuesday in July when a young man named Samuel Thompson stopped appearing at evening prayers, and nobody asked why his voice had vanished from the work songs that used to drift across the canyon at sunset. Sophia Brown had not always belonged to Crimson Ridge. She had not always moved through kitchens with the careful precision of someone navigating a minefield. Memory, when she allowed it, carried her back to Virginia, to a small plot of land where her mother grew herbs and her father repaired wagon wheels. Free people, for a time, until the Panic of 1837 made paper promises worth less than the ink that marked them. Debt was a noose that tightened slowly. First the land, then the tools, then the bodies themselves, sold to cover what was owed. Sophia was 23 when she arrived in the New Mexico territory, part of a shipment of contract laborers that Jacob Garcia purchased through a broker in St. Louis. The contract said 7 years. That was 11 years ago. Garcia had a talent for extending terms, for finding new debts, for making freedom a horizon that retreated with each step forward. The territory itself was a contradiction wrapped in violence. Officially free soil under the Compromise of 1850, but freedom was interpretive in a place where territorial law was whatever the man with the most land and guns said it was. The nearest federal marshal was in Santa Fe, 3 days, ride across desert that killed the unprepared. Local law meant Sheriff William Brown, no relation, who owed his position to Garcia's political connections and financial support. What would you do if the law wore the brand of the man you feared? Crimson Ridge Estate sprawled across a high desert valley, 3,000 acres of scrubland, canyon, and seasonal creeks that could flood or vanish depending on the sky's mood. Garcia ran cattle, but the real profit came from his position as a supply contractor. He sold beef to army forts, to mining camps, to the steady stream of settlers pushing west along the Santa Fe Trail. His reputation for quality and reliability made him wealthy. His ability to keep costs low made him wealthier. Keeping costs low required certain flexibilities. Pattern interrupt, preserved in ink and ignorance. Territorial Census, New Mexico Territory, 1850. Crimson Ridge Estate lists 63 souls in residence. Detailed breakdown: 8 family members, 3 permanent hired hands, 52 contract laborers. Notation in margin, written in different hand. High turnover. Query? Second notation below it. Resolved. No action required. The Garcia family lived in the main house, the sprawling adobe structure built in the Spanish style around a central courtyard. Thick walls kept the interior cool even in August. Windows faced east to catch morning light and west to frame the sunset over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The dining hall occupied the entire southern wing, large enough to host territorial officials, traveling merchants, and visiting ranchers. Jacob Garcia used hospitality as currency, and his table bought silence more effectively than threats. The kitchen, by contrast, existed in permanent twilight. Located in a separate building connected to the main house by a covered walkway, it was designed to keep cooking heat and smells away from the family's living quarters. The separation also served another purpose. What happened in the kitchen stayed in the kitchen. The screams of punishment, the evidence of brutality, the mathematics of missing people, all of it contained within walls too thick to carry sound. Sophia shared the kitchen quarters with 5 others. Thomas Anderson, the butcher, who had arrived 2 years before her and rarely spoke except in grunts and nods. Amelia Moore, sold to cover her father's gambling debts. 2 others whose names changed with such frequency that Sophia had stopped trying to remember them, knowing they would vanish like morning frost. And 1 empty bed, a pallet rolled against the wall, that used to belong to Samuel Thompson before that Tuesday in July. The smokehouse stood 50 yards from the kitchen, a windowless adobe structure with a heavy door and iron lock. Only 3 people held keys: Jacob Garcia, his foreman, a man named Richard Hayes, who had learned cruelty in the California goldfields, and Sophia, because someone had to manage the inventory, someone had to know what hung from which hook, someone had to be trusted with the keys to the kingdom of meat. Trust was a word that meant something different when you held the keys to your own prison. Inside the smokehouse, the air stayed cool even in summer, the thick walls and packed earth floor creating a natural refrigeration. Hooks hung from ceiling beams rated to hold up to 200 pounds each. In winter, they held hogs and cattle, properly butchered, properly documented. In other seasons, they held other things, things that appeared after someone vanished from the evening roll call, things that Garcia and Hayes would butcher themselves, late at night, sending Sophia away with orders not to return until morning. But Sophia had learned to watch, to notice which hooks held weight, to count the cuts of meat that appeared wrapped in muslin, to measure the amount against the livestock ledger that Garcia kept in his office, the one that never quite matched reality. Anecdote, carried in whispers. A trader passing through in spring of 1851 had commented on the quality of Garcia's beef. "Tastes different," he had said. "Sweeter somehow." "What do you feed them?" Garcia had smiled, that broad smile that never reached his eyes. Special diet, he had replied. Corn and care. But there was no cornfield at Crimson Ridge. Only scrubland and canyon grass. The trader had left the next morning, earlier than planned, and never returned. The system at Crimson Ridge operated on calculated terror. Garcia was not a man who yelled or ranted. He spoke softly, politely, with the measured tones of someone who had never doubted his right to rule. His punishments came swift and surgical. A hand held too long over the cooking fire for overcooking a roast. A day locked in the root cellar without water for speaking out of turn. Disappearances for offenses never fully explained. The disappeared left traces, a pair of boots too worn to be worth keeping, a letter hidden under a mattress, unfinished, unsent, a carved wooden cross that someone had worn around their neck. These items would appear in Sophia's quarters with a simple note, "Dispose of this." She kept them instead, hidden in a sack buried beneath the kitchen floor. A ledger of bones, as Thomas called it, evidence that would mean nothing to the law but everything to those who remained. What would you do, living in a place where the evidence of horror was handed to you with instructions to destroy it, where survival meant complicity, where every meal you cooked might contain someone you had known, someone you had prayed with, someone whose laugh you could still hear echoing in memory? By 1852, Sophia had learned to navigate this world with the precision of a cartographer mapping enemy territory. She knew Garcia's moods by the sound of his boots on the walkway. She knew when Hayes was drinking by the way he whistled, off-key and menacing. She knew which visitors to the ranch could be trusted with certain information, though trust was always relative and always dangerous. She also learned chemistry, not from books she could not read, but from observation and memory passed down from her mother, who had known plants and their properties. She learned that certain seeds, ground fine and mixed into strong flavors, could cause stomach cramps. That certain roots, dried and powdered, could produce a bitterness that mesquite smoke would cover. That rat poison, purchased openly from the general store in Albuquerque, came in white crystals that dissolved in rendered fat and left almost no taste when properly prepared. Pattern interrupt, evidence buried in commerce. Sales ledger, Miller's General Store, Albuquerque, New Mexico Territory. Entry dated June 3, 1852. Arsenic powder, 2 pounds, purchased by Sophia Brown on behalf of Crimson Ridge Estate. Purpose noted, rat control in grain storage. June 14, 1852. Arsenic powder, 1 pound. Same purchaser. July 8, 1852. Arsenic powder, 3 pounds. Same purchaser. Paid in cash. The accumulation had been patient, a pound here, a pound there, spread across 3 months and explained with the universal truth that every ranch fought rats. No one questioned it. No one would question it until much later, when accountants tried to reconstruct what had happened and found only ordinary purchases for an ordinary problem. But there was nothing ordinary about the amount. 6 pounds of arsenic was enough to kill 60 people if properly distributed. Sophia had no intention of killing 60 people. She had a very specific number in mind, 14. The exact count of those who would gather at the Garcia family table on September 14, 1852, for the weekly feast that celebrated prosperity built on vanished lives. The preparation had begun in August, when Sophia requested permission to try new recipes for the upcoming christening celebration. Garcia, always eager to impress visitors, had agreed. The smokehouse received new inventory, properly documented this time, legitimate cattle from a legitimate purchase. But there were other cuts as well, wrapped separately, marked with symbols that only Sophia and Hayes understood. The last pieces of Samuel Thompson, who had made the mistake of talking about running, about getting word to the territorial marshal, about ending the nightmare. Thompson had been 24. He had been strong, hopeful, foolish enough to believe that justice existed for people like them. His disappearance had been explained as desertion. His portions had been served at Sunday dinner. His bones had been buried in the arroyo where flash floods would scatter them beyond recognition. Sophia remembered his face. She remembered all their faces. The ledger in her mind was more accurate than any Garcia kept in his office. 17 people in 11 years. 17 names crossed out while the supper table stayed full and the guests praised the quality of the meat. What would you do if you kept count? If you knew the arithmetic of horror, if you measured it in pounds of flesh, if you understood that every compliment Garcia received was a prayer spoken over graves. The planning required not just chemistry but theater. Sophia had to maintain her mask of obedience, had to show no change in routine, had to cook with the same care she always demonstrated. She consulted with Garcia about the menu for September 14th, suggesting dishes that would mask any slight bitterness, recommending heavy spices and rich glazes. He approved everything, pleased with her initiative, seeing only what he expected to see, a talented cook preparing a memorable feast. Thomas knew. She had not told him, but he knew. They had worked side by side for 9 years, and some knowledge transfers through silence more efficiently than speech. When she began bringing unusual amounts of certain ingredients into the kitchen, when she spent extra time at the hearth testing reductions, when she filed that notch into the smokehouse latch, he said nothing but his hands moved differently, more deliberately, as if he too were counting down to something. Amelia did not know. Sophia kept her ignorant, deliberately, kept her young and uninvolved, kept her hands clean of what was coming. Some people needed to survive as witnesses. Some people needed to carry the story forward when the smoke cleared. August bled into September. The desert prepared for autumn in its own way, the heat losing its edge by degrees, the light turning from brass to gold. At Crimson Ridge, preparation took different forms. Garcia prepared for his sister's arrival, ordering new furnishings from Santa Fe, having the courtyard whitewashed, sending riders out to invite every person of importance within 3 days. Travel. He intended the christening celebration to cement his status as a territorial power, a man of influence and hospitality. Sophia prepared too, but her preparation happened in the shadows between Garcia's attention. September 1st, 1852, 4:30 a.m. Sophia rose before dawn, as always, to start the kitchen fire. The hour before sunrise belonged to her, a sliver of solitude in a world that allowed none. She used it to check her hidden stores. Beneath a loose adobe brick in the northwest corner of the kitchen, wrapped in oilcloth, lay 3 small packets. White powder, carefully divided, each packet containing enough to make a grown man violently ill. Together, properly distributed, they contained enough to stop 14 hearts. Sound, the pop and crack of mesquite wood catching fire, the distant howl of coyotes finishing their night hunt. Her own breathing, steady and measured, the rhythm of someone who had already made peace with consequences. Smell, cold desert air, carrying creosote and sage. The faint mineral tang of arsenic, when she unwrapped one packet to check its consistency. Her own sweat, despite the morning chill, the body knowing what the mind had decided. Texture, the powder between her fingers, fine as flour, slightly gritty, the rough oilcloth that kept it dry, the porous adobe brick that slid back into place with a scrape that sounded, to her paranoid ear, loud enough to wake the dead. She replaced the brick and began the day's work. Bread dough first, kneaded and set to rise. Coffee boiled in the large pot, strong enough to stand a spoon in, the way Garcia liked it. Breakfast for the family. Cornmeal mush, fried potatoes, strips of bacon from legitimate pork, nothing that would raise suspicion or cause illness. The poison was reserved for something special. By 6 a.m., the kitchen filled with others. Thomas arrived silent as always, immediately beginning his work at the butchering block. Amelia followed, rubbing sleep from her eyes, starting on the dishes from the previous night. The rhythm of the kitchen established itself, familiar and unbreakable, the choreography of survival. September 3rd, 7:15 p.m. Garcia summoned Sophia to his office, a room in the main house that smelled of leather and tobacco. He sat behind a massive desk, ledgers spread before him, a glass of whiskey at his elbow. "The menu for the 14th, he said without preamble. "I want something memorable, something that will make an impression." Sophia stood with her hands folded, eyes downcast in the posture of submission she had perfected. "Yes, sir. I was thinking a pozole to start. Then, roasted meat, perhaps venison if we can get it, with a honey glaze and herbs. Tamales. A stew with chilies and tomatoes. Biscuits. For dessert, a pudding made with dried fruit." Garcia nodded, pleased. "Good, very good. And the meat? We have enough?" "Yes, sir." The smokehouse is well stocked. He studied her for a moment, and Sophia felt the weight of his attention like a hand on her throat. But she had learned to show nothing, to be a mirror that reflected only what he wanted to see. Finally, he waved her away. "Excellent. Don't disappoint me." "No, sir. I won't." She left his office and walked back to the kitchen in the gathering dusk, her heart hammering but her pace steady. She would not disappoint him. That much was true. She would give him exactly what he deserved. What would you do in that moment? Standing before someone who had consumed your people, who had praised your skill while grinding you under his boot, who trusted you because he could not imagine you as anything but his tool. Would you flinch? Would something in your face betray you, or would you have learned, as Sophia had, to become stone? September 8th afternoon. The christening guests began arriving. Garcia's sister, Martha Davis, traveled from Missouri with her husband and infant son. A territorial judge came from Santa Fe with his wife, a merchant from Albuquerque, a rancher from the Pecos Valley, 2 Army officers from Fort Union, a priest from the mission at Taos. By evening, the main house buzzed with conversation and the presumption of importance. Sophia cooked for them all, meal after meal, each one perfect, each one building her reputation. The guests complimented Garcia on his excellent cook. He beamed, accepting praise as his due. "She's been with me for years," he told the judge. "Absolutely reliable. Makes the best table between here and California." The judge's wife leaned forward, curious. "Do you ever worry about, trusting them in the kitchen? I've heard stories from back east." Garcia laughed, a booming sound full of certainty. "Not this one. She knows which side her bread is buttered on. Besides, I'm always fair. Firm but fair. They respect that." In the kitchen, Thomas heard this through the open window. He caught Sophia's eye, neither spoke, but something passed between them, a recognition, a shared understanding that fairness was a word Garcia used for something entirely different than its meaning. September 12th, 9 a.m., Sophia made her final purchase at Miller's General Store in Albuquerque. She traveled there with Amelia and one of Garcia's hired hands, ostensibly to buy supplies for the feast. While the hired hand loaded sacks of flour and beans, Sophia approached the counter. "I need arsenic," she told the clerk. 3 pounds. The rats are terrible this season." The clerk, a young man named Peter Miller, nodded without interest. Rat poison was a common purchase. He measured out the powder, wrapped it in brown paper, and recorded the sale in his ledger. "That'll be $2. Sophia counted out coins from the purse Garcia had given her for supplies. Peter never looked at her face, never wondered why one estate needed so much poison, never questioned anything beyond the transaction. Why would he? She was just a cook buying supplies. He handed over the package with the same attention he gave every customer. None at all. On the ride back to Crimson Ridge, Sophia held the package in her lap, wrapped innocently among the legitimate purchases. The hired hand drove the wagon, whistling off-key, thinking about his wages. Amelia dozed in the afternoon heat. And Sophia calculated, 9 pounds total divided into 14 portions, dissolved in fat and glaze in stew. Enough to ensure that September 14th would be a meal remembered across the territory for generations. Pattern interrupt. Testimony recorded decades later. Interview with Peter Miller, 1891, Denver, Colorado. "Did I sell her the arsenic? Yes, I suppose I did, but how was I supposed to know? She bought it 3-4 times that summer. Always said it was for rats. I believed her, why wouldn't I?" Looking back now, knowing what happened, I sometimes wonder if I should have asked more questions. But then I remember, I was 20 years old, working my father's store, and she was just another customer. We sold arsenic to half the ranches in the territory. It was as common as flour. How was I supposed to know? September 13th, the day before, Sophia worked through the night, sleeping only in brief intervals. The preparation was meticulous. Each dish had to be perfect, had to taste exactly as expected, had to carry its hidden cargo without detection. The pozole came together first, a traditional stew of hominy and meat, heavy with chilies and garlic. The arsenic went into the broth, dissolved completely, masked by the aggressive flavors. She tasted it carefully, just enough to confirm the bitterness was hidden. It was. The roasted meat required more precision. She had legitimate venison, purchased and documented, but she prepared it with a glaze made from honey, crushed juniper berries, and rendered fat that contained dissolved poison. The glaze would soak into the meat as it roasted, distributing the arsenic evenly. Anyone eating more than a few bites would receive a fatal dose. The tamales used masa mixed with lard that had been carefully prepared. The stew, like the pozole, carried poison in its base. Even the biscuits, seemingly innocent, were made with contaminated butter. Every dish on the table would deliver death, some quickly, some slowly, but all certainly. Thomas worked beside her through the night, saying nothing but understanding everything. When she prepared the poisoned glaze, he turned away, giving her privacy for the act. When she wrapped the tamales, he cleaned the butchering block with unusual care, removing any evidence of legitimate meat preparation. They moved together in silence, two people executing a plan that existed only in the space between words. At 3 a.m., Sophia paused and sat heavily on a kitchen stool. Her hands trembled, the first time they had shown any weakness. Thomas brought her water, set it beside her without comment. She drank, then looked at him in the dim lamplight. 17, she said, just the one word. Thomas nodded. 17. They did not need to say more. 17 people consumed. 14 people would pay the price. The mathematics was not perfect, but it was the closest thing to justice they could manufacture. At dawn on September 14th, Sophia stood at the kitchen door and watched the sun rise over the canyon. The sky turned from black to purple to rose to gold, the transformation so beautiful it hurt. She wondered if this would be the last sunrise she saw as a free woman. She wondered if freedom was even the right word for what came next. Behind her, the kitchen waited, the food prepared, the table set for slaughter. Above, the Garcia family and their guests still slept, unaware that their final meal was ready, that the cook they trusted had spent the night preparing their deaths with the same care she had once used to earn their praise. Sound, birds beginning their morning songs, the creak of the windmill starting to turn as the breeze picked up, her own heart hammering against her ribs like something trying to escape. Smell, mesquite smoke from the banked fire, the food waiting to be served, innocent in its presentation. The desert air, clean and sharp, indifferent to human plans. Texture, the worn wood of the doorframe under her palm, the weight of the small knife tucked in her apron, the ground beneath her feet, solid and real, the last moment before everything changed. September 14th, 1852, 6:47 p.m. The hour had arrived. Sophia tied her apron, checked each dish one final time, and prepared to serve dinner at Crimson Ridge Estate, a dinner that would be remembered. A dinner that would answer, in blood and bile, the question of what happens when appetite meets its reckoning. What would you do, standing at that threshold, knowing you held poison in your hands, knowing 14 people would die, knowing some were guilty, some complicit, some merely unfortunate enough to be born into the wrong family? Would you carry those plates upstairs? Would you ring the dinner bell? Would you serve what you had prepared? Sophia did. She carried the first tray toward the dining hall, her footsteps steady on the stairs. Behind her, Thomas and Amelia followed with more dishes. Above, the Garcia family gathered, laughing and expectant, ready to feast. The clock on the mantel read 6:47 p.m. exactly, the last grains of sand before the glass turned over, the final breath before the scream. September 14th, 1852, 6:47 p.m. The dining hall at Crimson Ridge Estate glowed with lamplight and anticipation. 14 people arranged themselves around the long mesquite table, their faces bright with the easy confidence of those who had never questioned where their next meal came from. Jacob Garcia sat at the head, his sister Martha to his right, the territorial judge to his left. The arrangement was deliberate, a display of family, power, and respectability arranged like pieces on a chessboard. Sound, the scrape of chairs against tile as guests settled themselves, the clink of silverware being arranged just so. Low conversation punctuated by laughter, the kind that comes easy when the world seems built for your comfort. Smell, beeswax candles burning in iron holders, the lingering scent of tobacco from Garcia's after-dinner cigars, smoked prematurely in celebration. Underneath, the first hints of what was coming from the kitchen, rich and spiced, promising satisfaction. Texture, starched linen napkins placed across laps, the smooth surface of hand-carved plates, made by craftsmen in Santa Fe. The worn grain of the Mesquite table polished by years of similar gatherings, each one a performance of civilization in a territory that rewarded brutality. Garcia stood, raising his glass of whiskey before the first course had even arrived. "To family," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of a man accustomed to being heard. "To prosperity, to the bonds that make us strong in this wild country." The guests raised their glasses in return. "To family," they echoed. Martha Garcia Davis smiled at her brother, her infant son sleeping peacefully in a cradle near the fireplace. The judge nodded approvingly. The army officers, crisp in their uniforms despite the dust of travel, drank deeply. None of them noticed the slight delay before the response came from the kitchen doorway, where Sophia stood with the first tray. 6:52 p.m. Sophia entered the dining hall with the pozole, Amelia close behind carrying a second tureen. The transition from kitchen to dining hall was a threshold Sophia had crossed thousands of times. But tonight each step felt weighted, significant, as though the floor might remember her footprints long after she was gone. She set the tureen before Garcia with practiced grace. He nodded his approval without looking at her face. He never looked at her face. In 11 years, he had probably looked at her directly, fewer than a dozen times, and always with the gaze one might give to a useful piece of furniture. She was a function, not a person. That invisibility had kept her alive. Tonight, it would help her kill. "Smells wonderful," the judge's wife commented as Amelia ladled pozole into her bowl. "What's in it?" "Hominy, pork, chilies, garlic," Garcia answered as if he had made it himself. "Sophia has a way with traditional recipes, best cook in the territory." Sophia retreated to the doorway, hands folded, watching. Thomas waited just outside in the covered walkway, ready to bring the next course. Their eyes met briefly. His face showed nothing, but his hands were completely still, no fidgeting, no nervous movement. The stillness of someone who had already made peace with whatever came next. The first spoons lifted to mouths. The judge tasted, considered, nodded. "Excellent," he pronounced. Martha tried hers and made a small sound of pleasure. Around the table, the verdict came in through gestures and continued eating. No one detected anything wrong. The chilies and garlic masked what needed masking. The arsenic dissolved into the broth like a secret kept in plain sight. 7:03 p.m. Sophia brought the second course. Roasted venison, glazed and steaming, arranged on a platter with sprigs of sage for decoration. The meat had cooked slowly all afternoon, the poison-laced glaze soaking deep into every fiber. She placed it before Garcia, who immediately began carving, his knife moving with the confident strokes of a man who had butchered many things in his time. What would you do, watching someone carve meat that would kill them? Knowing that each slice they served to their family was a portion of death, that their confident performance of hospitality was the mechanism of their own destruction. Would you feel triumph, horror, the cold satisfaction of mathematics finally balancing? Sophia felt nothing. 11 years had taught her to keep feeling locked away where it could not betray her. She watched Garcia serve his sister first, a gesture of brotherly affection. Watched him place the largest portion on the judge's plate, a performance of generosity. Watched him take his own serving last, as a good host should, unaware that the portions no longer mattered. They had all consumed enough from the pozole. The venison was simply confirmation, a second sentence in case the first was not sufficient. 7:15 p.m. The conversation at the table grew louder, fueled by whiskey and the satisfaction of eating well. Garcia told a story about a business deal in Santa Fe, embellishing his own cleverness. The rancher from Pecos Valley countered with a tale of a cattle drive. The army officers discussed Apache movements in the territory, their tone casual, as if discussing weather rather than people fighting for their homeland. Martha asked about the christening ceremony planned for Sunday. The priest from Taos assured her it would be beautiful, that the child would be welcomed properly into the community of faith. He had already blessed the food, a quick prayer before eating, words about gratitude and providence that rang hollow in Sophia's ears. What kind of God rewarded men like Garcia? What kind of faith-blessed tables built on bones? In the kitchen, Amelia washed dishes with shaking hands. She did not understand what was happening, but she sensed something wrong in the air, the way animals sense storms before they arrive. Thomas stood at the window, watching the dining hall through the wavy glass, his jaw working silently as if chewing words he could not speak. 7:24 p.m. The tamales came next, carried by Sophia with steady hands. The masa was perfect, the filling rich with meat and spices. Garcia praised them loudly, urging his guests to try them. "Nobody makes tamales like this," he boasted. "I've had them in Mexico City, in San Antonio, nowhere compares." The judge's wife took a small bite, then a larger one. "He's right," she admitted, surprised. "These are extraordinary." Sophia accepted the compliment with a slight nod, the performance of humility expected from someone in her position. But behind her downcast eyes, she was counting. Counting bites, counting minutes, counting the time until the arsenic built to critical levels in 14 stomachs. The timeline was not precise. She was not a trained chemist. But she had done her research through observation and careful experimentation on rats captured from the grain storage. She knew approximately when symptoms would begin. 7:31 p.m. The first sign came from Martha. She paused mid-sentence, her hand moving to her stomach. A small gesture, barely noticeable, dismissed with a quiet laugh. "Ate too quickly," she murmured, and continued her story. But Sophia saw. The clock had started. Garcia reached for another tamale, his appetite seemingly endless. The judge pushed his chair back slightly, as if needing more room. One of the army officers coughed, a dry sound that caught in his throat. Small things, easily explained, not yet alarming. The meal continued. What would you do in those minutes of waiting? Knowing that beneath the conversation and laughter, chemistry was working, that cells were beginning to fail, that the body's defenses were mobilizing against an enemy they could not identify or defeat, would you stay and watch? Would you flee before the realization came? Sophia stayed. She brought the next course, a stew thick with chilies and tomatoes, more food piled atop the poison already consumed. She brought biscuits, butter, a pudding for dessert. She performed her role flawlessly, the trusted cook ensuring her employer's feast was everything he had demanded. Memorable. Impressive. Unforgettable. 7:45 p.m. Martha stood abruptly, her napkin falling from her lap. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tight. "I need some air." She moved toward the door with quick, unsteady steps. Garcia frowned, concerned. "Sister, are you well?" "Just the heat," she replied, but her face had gone pale, a sheen of sweat visible on her forehead despite the evening cool. She made it to the courtyard before doubling over, one hand braced against the adobe wall. The sound of her retching carried back into the dining hall, sharp and wet. The judge half rose from his seat. "Perhaps we should call for a doctor." But even as he spoke, his own face changed, color draining, confusion crossing his features. His wife gripped the edge of the table, her breathing shallow and quick. 7:48 p.m. The dining hall transformed. What had been a celebration became something else, something that moved too fast for understanding. Garcia stood, swaying, his hand reaching for the wall. "What is this?" His voice carried genuine bewilderment, the confusion of a man whose world had always bent to his will, now experiencing something beyond his control. The rancher from Pecos Valley collapsed sideways in his chair, his glass shattering on the tile floor. One of the army officers tried to stand, made it halfway up, and fell heavily, taking his plate with him. The crash of breaking pottery punctuated the sounds of distress, now coming from every corner of the room. The priest began to pray, his voice steady at first, then cracking as his own stomach cramped. "Our Father, who art in heaven," he managed, before the prayer dissolved into gasping. 7:51 p.m. Sophia stood in the doorway, watching. Thomas had moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and silent. Amelia appeared behind them, her eyes wide with horror and understanding. "What did you do?" she whispered. Sophia did not answer. There was no answer that would fit into words, no explanation that could compress 11 years of accumulated horror, 17 names, countless meals served over vanished people, into a response that Amelia could understand. Instead, she watched Garcia, who had dropped to his knees, his hands clutching his stomach, his face a mask of agony and dawning realization. His eyes found hers across the room. For the first time in 11 years, Jacob Garcia truly looked at Sophia Brown. saw her not as a function or a tool, but as a person with will and agency and the capacity for vengeance. In that moment of recognition, something shifted in his expression. Not remorse, Sophia thought, but surprise. Genuine shock that the world could work this way, that power could flow in reverse, that the consumed could become the consumer. "You," he managed, the word more breath than voice. "You did this." Sophia met his gaze without flinching. 17, she said clearly. "I counted everyone." Garcia tried to respond, but his body had other priorities. He collapsed forward, his forehead striking the tile with a sound that echoed in the suddenly quiet room. Around him, his family and guests fought their own battles with failing bodies, with the betrayal of food that should have nourished but instead destroyed. 7:53 p.m. The clock on the mantel continued its steady marking of time, indifferent to the scene playing out beneath it. Tick, tick, tick. Each second, another step away from the world as it had been, toward something new and terrible and irreversible. In the cradle near the fireplace, Martha's infant son began to cry. The only person in the room who had not eaten, who remained untouched by the poison, his wails rising above the sounds of adult suffering. Amelia moved without thinking, crossing the room to lift the boy, holding him close, turning her back on the dining hall to shield him from what was happening. Thomas looked at Sophia. "We should go, now, before someone comes." But Sophia shook her head. "No, I stay, I watch." She had planned this, prepared this, executed this. She would not flee from the consequences. She would witness what she had done, hold it in her memory alongside everything that had been done to her. The ledger would balance completely, or not at all. Outside, the sun finished its descent behind the canyon walls. The dining hall at Crimson Ridge Estate, once bright with lamplight and celebration, now flickered with shadows that seemed to gather in corners, waiting. 14 people lay scattered across the floor and slumped in chairs, their feast incomplete, their future measured in minutes rather than years. Sophia stood in the doorway and counted breaths. 17 people had stopped breathing because of Jacob Garcia. 14 people would stop breathing because of her. The mathematics was almost balanced. 7:58 p.m. The dining hall had become a theater of collapse. Bodies sprawled across tile floor that reflected lamplight and pools of spreading sickness. The careful arrangement of the meal, the social choreography of a frontier elite gathering, all of it dissolved into base biology, into systems shutting down, into the body's desperate and failing attempt to expel poison already absorbed beyond recovery. Sound, labored breathing, wet and rattling, the scrape of fingernails against tile as someone tried to crawl toward the door. The infants continued wailing, persistent as a bell, the clock marking time with mechanical indifference. Tick, tick, tick. Smell, vomit and worse, the body evacuating through every available channel, the remnants of the feast, now spoiled by association. Beeswax candles still burning, their sweet scent turned sickly in the transformed air. Texture, Sophia's own hands, clenched at her sides, fingernails cutting into palms. The doorframe under her shoulder as she leaned for support. The weight of 11 years lifting, leaving her lighter and somehow heavier at once. The judge had managed to pull himself halfway to the door, leaving a trail of sickness behind him. His efforts grew weaker, his arms trembling with each attempted movement forward. His wife lay still near the table, her face turned toward the ceiling, eyes open but unseeing. The priest had fallen silent, his prayers abandoned or completed, his body curled on its side like a question mark. Garcia remained on his knees, swaying. His lips moved, forming words without sound. Sophia read them anyway. Why? How? The questions of a man whose worldview was collapsing faster than his organs. He had built an empire on the assumption that certain people existed for his use, that his needs justified any action, that power was its own morality. Tonight proved the instability of that foundation. 8:03 p.m. Martha Garcia Davis crawled back into the dining hall from the courtyard, her strength nearly spent. She was trying to reach her son, still crying in Amelia's arms. Each movement cost her visible agony, but maternal instinct pushed her forward, when her body wanted only to surrender. She made it 3 feet. 5 feet, collapsed 10 feet from the cradle, her hand outstretched. "Please," she whispered, the word directed at no one and everyone. "My baby, please." Amelia looked to Sophia, the question clear on her young face. Sophia nodded once. Amelia knelt beside Martha, still holding the infant, and placed him where his mother could see him. Martha's hand, shaking violently, reached up to touch her son's foot. A final contact. Then her hand fell, and the light in her eyes dimmed to something distant and fading. What would you do, watching someone reach for their offspring in their final moments? Does guilt have a place in vengeance? Does the mathematics of justice account for innocence caught in the crossfire? Sophia had wrestled with these questions during her months of planning. Martha had not personally harmed anyone at Crimson Ridge. The judge's wife had never ordered a beating. The priest had only blessed tables, unknowing or willfully blind. But they had all eaten, they had all benefited, they had all looked away when looking might have cost them something. The infant, though. The infant was pure innocence, and Sophia had ensured he would not eat. Some lines she would not cross, some arithmetic she could not balance. The boy would live, would grow up hearing whispered stories about this night, would carry the weight of survival into whatever future the territory offered him. That seemed punishment enough. 8:09 p.m. Garcia made a sound, something between a growl and a sob. He had collapsed fully now, lying on his side, his eyes still locked on Sophia. Blood seeped from his nose, a symptom of the poison's assault on his vessels and organs. His mouth worked, forcing out words with the last reserves of strength. "They will hang you," he managed. "You and every one of them. You will die screaming." Sophia stepped into the room for the first time since the collapse began. She walked carefully around the scattered bodies, her steps measured, until she stood directly over Jacob Garcia. She looked down at the man who had owned her time, her labor, her autonomy for 11 years. The man who had praised her cooking while serving his guests the flesh of those who had tried to resist him. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but you will die first. And you will die knowing that I beat you. That the woman you never even looked at, the cook you thought was nothing more than hands in obedience, she was the one who ended you. Remember that. In whatever time you have left, remember that you died because you forgot we were human." Garcia's response was lost in a spasm of coughing that brought up blood. His body convulsed once, twice, and went still. The eyes remained open, staring at nothing, the proud frontier rancher reduced to another body on his own dining hall floor. 8:14 p.m. The others followed in ones and twos. The rancher from Pecos Valley, who had laughed about making his workers compete for water rations during the summer heat. The army officer who had joked about teaching natives respect through superior firepower. The merchant from Albuquerque who had sold supplies to Garcia without ever asking why his workforce kept shrinking. Each one carried their own ledger of complicity, their own weight of looking away or actively participating in a system built on dehumanization. The judge lasted longest, his body fighting with the tenacity of someone accustomed to winning arguments. But biology respects no titles. At 8:19 p.m. he gasped his final breath, and the dining hall at Crimson Ridge Estate went quiet except for the infant's continued crying. 14 bodies. 14 people who would never again sit at a table and consume the labor of others without thought. The mathematics was complete. Thomas entered the dining hall, his footsteps loud in the new silence. He surveyed the scene with the same expressionless face he brought to butchering, the mask of someone who had learned to separate himself from the work of death. "It's done," he said unnecessarily. "It's done," Sophia agreed. Amelia stood with the infant, her face wet with tears. "What happens now?" "They will come looking. They will know." "They will know," Sophia confirmed, "but not tonight. Tonight we prepare." 8:30 p.m. The practical work of aftermath began, not with cleaning or covering, but with documentation. Sophia had Thomas light additional lamps, flooding the dining hall with light that erased all shadows. She wanted to see clearly what she had done, wanted to deny herself any merciful dimness that might soften the reality of 14 bodies scattered across tile and table. Sound. The infant's crying had finally subsided into hiccuping whimpers as Amelia rocked him. Their own breathing, quick and shallow despite the lack of immediate threat. The distant howl of coyotes beginning their night hunt, unaware of the larger predation that had occurred in the adobe building. Smell. The dining hall had become unbearable, the scent of death mixing with interrupted feast. Sophia ignored it, breathing through her mouth, moving through the space with deliberate attention to detail. Texture. The smooth surface of a tin cup she filled with water from the courtyard well. The rough weave of muslin she used to cover Martha's face, a gesture of respect or habit, she was not certain which. The paper and pencil she retrieved from Garcia's office, preparing to write what would become either a confession or a testimony. She sat at the only clear chair remaining, pushed aside the dishes, and began to write. Her letters were crude, learned late and practiced little, but serviceable. She wrote slowly, carefully, knowing this document might be the only voice she had when the law arrived. To whoever finds this, my name is Sophia Brown. I was held at Crimson Ridge Estate for 11 years, under contract that was extended without my consent. I prepared the food that killed Jacob Garcia and his guests on September 14, 1852. I did this because Garcia and his foreman killed 17 people who lived and worked here. Their names were... She listed them. Every name she could remember from 11 years of watching people vanish. Samuel Thompson, Maria Rodriguez, Chen Wei, Marcus Washington. On and on. 17 names that Garcia had erased from his official records, but could not erase from the memory of those who remained. They were butchered in the smokehouse and served at Garcia's table. I have evidence hidden beneath the kitchen floor. I fed Garcia his own evil. The others who died tonight were guilty of eating what was served and asking no questions. I am not sorry. I am ready for whatever justice comes. She signed it with the careful letters of her name and set the document on the table where it could not be missed. Then she stood and began the next phase, preparation for discovery. 9 p.m. The workers' quarters, half a mile across the canyon floor, remained quiet. The people there had learned to mind their own business, to ignore sounds from the main house, to survive by maintaining strategic ignorance. Sophia walked there alone, leaving Thomas and Amelia with the infant, carrying a lantern that swung with each step. She found them gathered in small clusters, speaking in low voices. They had noticed that no one had been dismissed from the main house, that the dinner was running long, that something felt wrong in the air. When Sophia appeared, they went silent. "It's over," she told them. "Garcia is dead. All of them are dead. I poisoned their food." The silence deepened, then broke. Questions erupted. Demands for explanation. Accusations. Fear. A woman named Elena gripped Sophia's arm. "What have you done? They will kill us all for this. They will burn us out or worse." "Maybe," Sophia acknowledged, "or maybe they will see that we were not involved, that it was one person's decision, my decision. I have written a confession that makes that clear." An older man named William stepped forward. "And if they don't believe your confession, if they decide we all knew? If they decide that we are all guilty by association? Then run," Sophia said bluntly. "The foreman is asleep in his cabin. The hired hands went to town this afternoon and have not returned. You have tonight to leave if you choose. By morning, someone will notice. By noon, the law will come. Decide now what you will do." She left them arguing among themselves and walked back to the main house. Behind her, the workers' quarters erupted into frantic activity. Some chose to flee immediately, gathering meager possessions and heading into the night toward destinations unknown. Others chose to stay, either from fear of running or faith that the truth would protect them. Sophia did not judge either choice. She had made her decision. They had to make theirs. 10:15 p.m. Back in the dining hall, Sophia and Thomas began the grim work of arranging bodies with more dignity. They moved each one to lie straight, composed hands across chests, closed eyes that had remained open. It was not mercy exactly. More like the completion of ritual, the acknowledgement that even in vengeance, some forms should be observed. Amelia had taken the infant to the kitchen, where she prepared a milk-soaked cloth for him to suck, trying to keep him fed and calm. She had decided to stay, though fear showed clear in every movement. "Someone needs to care for the boy," she said when Sophia questioned her choice. "He is innocent in this. Someone should remain who remembers that. What would you do with the orphan of your vengeance? The living remainder of your actions, innocent of any crime except being born into the wrong family at the wrong moment." Sophia had no answer that satisfied. She had ensured the infant would live, but his future beyond tonight was a question she could not resolve. By midnight, the main house stood as a monument to completion and waiting. The dining hall held 14 bodies, arranged and covered. The kitchen held evidence carefully preserved, the hidden packets of remaining poison, the receipts from the general store, the ledger of names buried beneath the floor. Sophia's written confessions sat on the table, weighted down with a candlestick so no breeze could disturb it. Thomas sat in the courtyard, his back against the adobe wall, staring at stars that blazed in the clear desert sky. Sophia joined him, lowering herself to sit beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. "What will you do when they come?" Thomas asked. "Tell the truth. All of it. Show them the evidence, make them understand what happened here before tonight. They won't care. They will see dead white people and a living black woman with poison, and that will be all the truth they need. Perhaps, but I will tell it anyway, for the 17. For the record. So that someone, somewhere, sometime, might know that we did not accept what was done to us, that we found a way to resist." Thomas nodded slowly. "And if they hang you, then they hang me. But they will hang someone who died free, who made her own choice, who took back the power that was stolen. That is worth something." They sat in silence, waiting for dawn, waiting for discovery, waiting for whatever justice or vengeance the territory would bring. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the dramas of earthbound creatures, marking time that would continue long after everyone involved in this night had turned to dust. In the distance, a coyote sang its lonesome song. Another answered. The desert breathed its nighttime breath, cool and dry and eternal. At Crimson Ridge Estate, the reckoning was complete. Now came the accounting. September 15, 1852, dawn. The sun rose over Crimson Ridge Estate, with the same indifference it had shown every morning before, painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and rose. But the world beneath that sunrise had fundamentally changed. At 6:23 a.m., Richard Hayes, Garcia's foreman, approached the main house, expecting to begin another ordinary day of managing workers and inventory. Instead, he found silence where there should have been morning activity, stillness where motion should have marked the start of labor. Hayes entered through the kitchen, calling out for Sophia. No answer came. He walked through the covered walkway toward the dining hall, his boots echoing on tile, and stopped at the threshold. The scene before him required several seconds to process, his mind rejecting what his eyes reported. 14 bodies, arranged with strange care, covered with muslin and tablecloths. The smell hit him next, forcing him backward, one hand over his mouth. He ran, not toward the bodies to check for survivors, not toward help, but away, stumbling into the courtyard, where he bent double and vomited into the dust. When his stomach emptied, he straightened and looked around wildly. The workers' quarters across the canyon showed signs of abandonment, doors open, possessions scattered. The smokehouse doors swung slightly in the morning breeze. Everything familiar had become foreign, transformed overnight into something he could not comprehend. Hayes rode hard for the territorial sheriff's office in Socorro, 23 miles east. He arrived at 9:47 a.m., his horse lathered and blowing, his own face pale beneath desert dust. Sheriff William Brown, the same man who had accepted Garcia's financial support for years, listened to Hayes's babbling report with growing alarm. "All of them? Dead? Are you certain?" "I saw them myself. 14 people. Garcia, his sister, the judge, all of them, just lying there like someone arranged them for a funeral." Brown assembled a posse immediately. 6 men, armed and mounted, riding back toward Crimson Ridge with Hayes leading the way. They arrived at 1:15 p.m. to find the estate eerily quiet, The bodies remained as Hayes had described. But they also found Sophia sitting in the courtyard with her back against the adobe wall, waiting. She did not run when the posse arrived. Did not resist when Brown approached with his hand on his pistol. She simply stood, brushed dust from her skirt, and spoke clearly. "My name is Sophia Brown. I poisoned the food that killed these people. I did it because Jacob Garcia was a murderer who killed 17 people and fed them to his guests. I have written a full confession. It is on the dining table." The posse stared at her, this small woman in a stained apron, calmly confessing to mass murder. Brown recovered first, his lawman instincts overriding his shock. "You are under arrest. You will be taken to Socorro to await trial." He turned to his deputies. "Search the premises. Find evidence. Find witnesses." What they found, over the next 3 hours of searching, complicated the simple narrative of a cook gone mad. They found Sophia's written confession with its list of 17 names. They found the hidden packets of arsenic beneath the kitchen floor. They found the ledger of bones, the small personal effects of people who had vanished. They found, in Garcia's office, his own ledgers that showed discrepancies between livestock butchered and meat sold, between workers counted and workers present. Most damning, they found the smokehouse, the hooks rated for 200 pounds each, showing wear patterns consistent with heavy use. Stains on the floor that no amount of scrubbing had fully removed. Saw marks on the butchering table that told a story of practiced dismemberment. One deputy, a man who had worked as a butcher before becoming lawman, studied the evidence and went pale. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "this is not a livestock processing facility. Or rather, not only livestock. These patterns, these tools, the way things are arranged, someone was butchering larger animals here. Much larger." Brown understood the implication but did not want to accept it. To accept it would mean acknowledging that Garcia, a pillar of the territorial community, had been something monstrous. It would mean the meals Brown himself had eaten at this table might have contained something unspeakable. It would mean the entire social order of the territory rested on foundations more fragile than anyone had imagined. By 4:30 p.m., Sophia sat in shackles in a wagon headed for Socorro. Thomas and Amelia had also been arrested, though neither had confessed to any involvement. The infant remained with Amelia, his fate uncertain. Behind them, Crimson Ridge Estate stood empty, its secrets partially revealed, its future as uncertain as the prisoners it had produced. Pattern interrupt, preserved in official records. Territorial Sheriff's Report, September 16, 1852. Arrested one Sophia Brown, Negro woman, approximate age 34, for the poisoning deaths of 14 persons at Crimson Ridge Estate. Suspect confessed freely and provided written statement. Also arrested Thomas Anderson and Amelia Moore as potential accomplices. Evidence recovered suggests possible additional crimes at the estate predating the poisoning. Further investigation required. The journey to Socorro took 6 hours. Sophia rode in silence, her hands bound, her face composed. She had made her choice and accepted its consequences. But as the wagon rolled away from Crimson Ridge, she allowed herself one backward glance at the estate where she had spent 11 years. The buildings already looked abandoned, as if the land itself was rejecting what had occurred there, preparing to reclaim the space for mesquite and sage. In Socorro, news of the mass poisoning spread through the small territorial capital like wildfire. By nightfall, crowds gathered outside the jail, demanding to see the prisoner, shouting for immediate justice. Some called for hanging without trial. Others, a smaller group, asked questions. If Garcia was a murderer as claimed, did that change the moral calculation? If the law had failed to protect the vulnerable, did individuals have the right to seek their own justice? Sheriff Brown stood on the jailhouse steps and addressed the crowd. There will be a trial. Evidence will be presented. Justice will be served according to territorial law. I will not permit mob rule in my jurisdiction. His words calmed some, inflamed others, but ultimately the crowd dispersed as night fell and practical concerns overtook passion. Inside the jail, Sophia lay on a narrow cot in a cell barely large enough to stand in. Through the small barred window, She could see stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. The same stars that had watched over Crimson Ridge, that had witnessed everything that occurred there, that would continue their rotation long after everyone involved in this story had returned to dust. She thought of the 17 names on her list, wondered if they knew, wherever the dead go, that their deaths had been answered. Wondered if vengeance brought them any peace, or if peace was not the point. Perhaps the point was simply that someone had remembered, had counted, had refused to let their erasure stand unchallenged. Tomorrow would bring interrogation, legal maneuvering, the grinding machinery of territorial justice. But tonight, Sophia Brown slept more soundly than she had in 11 years. Her ledger balanced, her conscience clear, her future uncertain, but finally, undeniably, her own. October 1852. The trial of Sophia Brown became the most attended event in New Mexico Territory history. The makeshift courthouse in Socorro overflowed with spectators, journalists from as far as St. Louis, territorial officials, and citizens drawn by the sensational nature of the case. A woman accused of poisoning 14 people, claiming justification through allegations of cannibalistic murder. The story was too extraordinary to ignore. The prosecution presented their case with confidence. 14 bodies, indisputable. A written confession, signed and detailed. Witnesses who testified that Sophia had purchased large quantities of arsenic in the months before the deaths. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The prosecutor, a man named Jonathan Walker, brought from Santa Fe specifically for this case, argued that regardless of any alleged crimes by Garcia, murder was murder, and the law could not permit individuals to execute their own vengeance. But the defense, led by a young attorney named Christopher Thomas, who took the case without payment, presented something unexpected. He brought the ledger of bones. He brought Garcia's falsified records. He brought the butchering tools from the smokehouse, asking the territorial judge to consider their purpose. Most powerfully, he brought Thomas Anderson and 3 other former workers from Crimson Ridge who testified, under oath and at great personal risk, about the disappearances, the unexplained meat, the climate of terror. Pattern interrupt, recorded in trial transcripts. Testimony of Thomas Anderson, October 12, 1852. I saw Garcia and Hayes take Samuel Thompson into the smokehouse on a Tuesday evening in July. I heard sounds I recognized from livestock butchering. Thompson never came out. 3 days later, we had fresh meat at the workers' meal. I knew. God help me, I knew, and I said nothing because speaking meant joining him on those hooks. The testimony divided the courtroom and the territory. Some believed it completely, seeing in Sophia's actions a desperate response to unspeakable horror. Others dismissed it as fabrication designed to excuse murder, unwilling to accept that a respected rancher could have committed such atrocities. The truth, as often happens, mattered less than what people chose to believe. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On October 15, 1852, they returned a verdict that satisfied no one and everyone simultaneously. Guilty of murder, but with extraordinary circumstances acknowledged. The sentence, 15 years imprisonment rather than hanging, a compromise between vengeance and mercy that reflected the jury's inability to fully reconcile the competing narratives of the case. Sophia accepted the verdict without visible emotion. She was transported to the territorial prison in Santa Fe, where she would spend the next decade and a half. Thomas Anderson and Amelia Moore were released, the prosecution finding insufficient evidence of their direct involvement. Amelia took Martha's infant son and disappeared into the territory, raising him as her own under a different name in a different county where the story of Crimson Ridge had not yet penetrated. What became of Crimson Ridge Estate itself? The property was seized by the territorial government and sold at auction. No one bid. The building stood empty for 2 years before squatters moved in, then burned the main house to the ground. Claiming the place was haunted by screams, the land eventually returned to scrub and canyon, erasing the physical evidence of what had occurred there, though the story persisted. Sophia Brown served her sentence in silence, working in the prison kitchen with the same competence she had shown at Crimson Ridge. She was released in 1867, at age 49, into a transformed America. The Civil War had ended, slavery was abolished, the territories were being organized towards statehood. She traveled north to Colorado, where records show she worked as a cook in a boarding house in Denver until her death in 1891. In her final years, she gave one interview to a journalist researching the territorial period. Asked if she regretted her actions, she replied simply, "I regret that it was necessary. I do not regret that I did it. 17 people deserved to be remembered. I made sure they were." The story of the Crimson Ridge poisoning passed into legend, told and retold across the Southwest, changing with each telling. Some versions made Sophia a hero of resistance. Others painted her as a murderer who weaponized false accusations. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in the complicated space between narratives, in the place where horror and justice blur into something that defies easy categorization. The infant who survived that September night grew to adulthood never knowing his true parentage, raised by Amelia with love and care that tried to balance the scales of a night that took 14 lives and spared one. Whether that constitutes justice or simply survival remains a question without satisfying answer. Today, if you travel through New Mexico and ask old-timers about Crimson Ridge, some will know the story. They will tell you that on certain desert nights, when the wind moves through the canyon just right, you can still smell mesquite smoke and hear the ring of a dinner bell calling guests to a feast that never ends. They will tell you to be careful what you eat, to know where your food comes from, to remember that every meal carries the weight of those who prepared it. The land where Crimson Ridge Estate once stood is now part of a national wilderness area, protected and empty, returned to the silence that existed before Garcia built his empire of consumption. The only marker is a small historical plaque installed in 1973 that reads simply, "Site of Crimson Ridge Estate, 1841 to 1852. 14 people died here in September 1852. 17 others died here in the years before. All are remembered." In the end, Sophia Brown's legacy is not the poisoning itself, but the question it forces every generation to confront. When the law fails to protect the vulnerable, when power shields itself from accountability, when survival requires complicity and horror, what response is justified? What price is vengeance worth? And who gets to decide which deaths matter enough to remember? The desert offers no answers, only the patient accumulation of dust over questions that outlive the people who asked them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.